the local governments and the local political elites also bear a considerable amount of responsibility for their frankly poor stewardship of local economies. Hey everyone, this is Shingi here with Asoba DeFi, and today I'm going to talk to you about why it's so difficult to do business on the African continent. But first, I'll start by recalling what I talked about in the look forward to COP27, where I predicted that one of the key strategies by African countries was going to be to help drive investment or greater levels of investment towards Africa through the use of, we'll call them climate justice narratives, where African countries bear the brunt of climate change, or global south countries across the board bear the brunt of the cost of climate change, while only contributing a tiny fraction of the greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change. So that was one of the key topics of conversation in these first early days of COP27. Another one, though, was this idea of climate debt traps. Now, the concept of debt trap is one in which a country is provided loans that are not sufficient to actually drive the level of development that are necessary to repay those loans. And so more loans are actually needed to essentially service the debt and still accomplish that initial goal. And so you end up just like plowing yourself into more and more and more debt without actually being able to develop the capability to get out of that debt. Historically, that level of climate debt trap was driven by a specific economic philosophy that was very prominent within the IMF, which was monetarism, or essentially the thought process that control over monetary supply, or the control over money supply, was the only lever that was needed for an economy to drive economic development. That fiscal policy was actually not needed, and the less government intervention, the better. And that resulted in a lot of African governments accepting loans on the condition that they would take measures to reduce deficits, which ultimately ended up being removing subsidies and other government services that are provided to help support and help grow what is an immature economy, or an economy that's not fully developed and does not have a fully developed local business market. So the goal here was to avoid similar types of debt traps with climate-related financing, where instead of conditions that were related to monetary policy or how governments ran their fiscal policy, instead it was debt that was associated, or debt with strings attached, that was associated with meeting certain environmental conditions. These environmental conditions that may actually be prohibitive to the kind of growth that would allow the debt to actually help finance growth that can service the debt and still provide profits to the country. So again, you just reinforce the same debt traps, but instead of with monetarism, now it's with environmentally focused policies. So those have been the two big strategic focuses that African countries have in a concerted manner used their collective leverage to try to drive conversation and to try to drive financing availability to those countries. But within all of that, you may have seen a lot of narratives that paint these countries as victims of colonialism and victims of abusive geopolitical financial schemes. And while it is very true that these schemes are in fact extremely abusive, there is quite a bit of deliberate intent towards underdevelopment in order to maintain geopolitical position and maintain access to key commodities. The local governments and the local political elites also bear a considerable amount of responsibility for their frankly poor stewardship of local economies and their own abusiveness towards their citizens with regards to financial theft of treasury, of misallocation and misappropriation of investment dollars that do come in, and significant amount of corruption in which government officials take obscene levels of embezzlement without any form of accountability or any form of responsibility or transparency about what they're doing. So, with that in mind, those behaviors that I alluded to play a significant role in making business very difficult to do in Africa. And at the micro level, this difficulty that it actually is to do business is what bubbles up in the underdevelopment that you see at the top level. So even if you had better actors from the West with regards to the financial relationship that Western countries have with African countries, I believe that you would still have very similar issues in terms of attracting capital that you see today, where only 20% of all projects actually even have sufficient capital to do feasibility assessments, and this is 20% of infrastructure projects, have the ability to even do feasibility studies, much less actually make it to close of financing. Only 10% of projects actually even make it to close of financing. So you can see that there is an extreme bottleneck when it comes to project development, infrastructure project development, that has everything to do with the availability of capital. And again, the availability of capital, I believe there are 4 primary reasons why it is limited in African countries. The first reason has to do with trustworthiness. Investors are very skittish with governments that are not predictable. And in the context of regulatory risk, a predictable government is one in which it has a clear set of rules that it will reliably stick with for a long enough period of time to actually establish business and actually develop business opportunities, and that there is a fair framework for winning contracts from government, is a fair framework from having contract disputes actually being addressed, and that there is clear communication of policy change from government to the public, and there's some level of engagement with the public in the development of those policy stances. So all of those things are problematic issues across the board in African countries with regards to transparency of policy, with regards to rampant cronyism, and the support of insider dealing that allows for businesses that have close ties with government officials to get preferential access to government RFPs. Right? If you are a business, especially a foreign business that is bidding on government contracts, you want to have some level of trust and faith that your proposal will be evaluated based on the technical and financial strengths, and not what your relationship is, what your personal financial relationship is with key government officials. The second issue that impacts the ease of doing business in Africa has to do with liquidity. So liquidity here refers to the availability of capital within the system to actually transact. I think it also speaks a little bit to the velocity of money, which is essentially how many hands does the same dollar touch within a period of time. In an economy like the United States, where it's highly liquid, there's a high velocity of money, right? Dollars move around very quickly, and they circle back to you very quickly. In most African economies, money velocity is extremely low. Money stays within small pools of people, and it does not transfer or does not move outside of those. So there are whole swaths of population that are completely locked out of access to liquidity. When you have that much lack of access to liquidity, it also has some additional knock-on effects in terms of actual economic growth, economic development, which then has a knock-on effect of chasing away liquidity. The other issue with liquidity has to do with 2 types of risk. One is currency risk, one is sovereign risk. The currency risk has to do with the financial stewardship of the money supply by the central bank and by the government. So if the government is engaged in things like debt monetization, where the government is printing dollars at impunity and is relying on the central bank to buy that debt, and there's no other demand for that debt, you end up having a currency that ends up hyperinflating. When you have a hyperinflating currency, it becomes, again, very difficult to do business because you have no sense of what things have value, and you're constantly losing value with every dollar you put in. And so that requires your returns to be that much higher to keep pace with inflation. And when you chase returns that are that high, you end up chasing things that are extremely high risk. And again, if you're dealing with high risk investments in a country that is already low trustworthiness with the government, you end up in a situation where you have no recourse if someone bails on you, if somebody breaches contract. And so as an investor, you just avoid that. The other issue is sovereign risk, and this is an issue, again, that's common across the board in Africa, where you have governments that have such a level of debt overhang and debt arrears that there is no, typically a fiat currency, right, is backed by the faith in the government, the faith that you have that the government is actually able to repay its debt. When you have a government that is so far in its arrears, you lose your faith that they're able to pay their debt, and you see the credit ratings drop. You have whole currencies such as the South African rand that has fell to junk status, and this has been 5 or 6 years ago that has fallen to junk status. This is true for a lot of countries within that region. You also have the sovereign debtor themselves that have low credit worthiness because of their overhang, because of their arrears. So when you see them try to issue currency to print their way out of issues, again, they're forced into debt monetization because there is no other demand for the currency. So again, those issues result in liquidity drying up within the economy. If there's no liquidity in the economy and you're forced into debt monetization, you're basically forced into inflating your currency, which means you're forced into extremely high interest rates, which means that banks, your private lenders, are forced into very high interest rates in order to lend to businesses to actually do operations. Businesses can't afford 26, 25%, or even 50% interest rates like you see in Zimbabwe, because that's absurd, that level of interest that you have to pay. That is incredibly disincentivizing for people to actually take on debt to do business. People don't take on debt, people operate informally as opposed to formally, and they're forced to scramble for cash and to deal on the parallel markets in order to actually get the currency that they need to run their business. And so you end up having a large portion of your population working in the informal economy, which means that everybody is basically working in skunk mode 24/7, or skunk works 24/7, scraping together whatever penny they can find. And so they're always under-resourced. And so again, you have an economy full of vendors that you rely on, lenders that you rely on, etc., that are all under-resourced. There's a good chance that your supply chains are going to fail, or you're going to end up having severe price changes mid-flight in a business cycle that make it very difficult for you to operate. So third, those two things, the trustworthiness and liquidity issues, combine to create a high opportunity cost of investment. Because, as again, there are many other economies. If you're looking at whatever asset class you want to look at, you're comparing that same asset class and the returns available in each of the different countries that are within your footprint that you want to have operations within. So you're comparing, if you invest in commercial office buildings as your asset class, you're comparing the returns for commercial office buildings in the United States versus Brazil versus South Africa versus Pakistan versus Japan. And you're looking at which economy sort of geography-wide offers the best generalized returns over whatever period of time you're looking at. For an African country that deals with liquidity issues, that deals with high inflation, that deals with regulatory risk, severe regulatory risk, the opportunity cost of investment becomes very high to do business there. And so you look elsewhere to economies that are much easier to get higher levels of returns and don't force you to chase high-risk investments to just keep pace with the high levels of inflation or uncertainty that might exist. And then lastly, in terms of ease of doing business. Now, the UN used to have an index for ease of doing business that it discontinued, I think, in 2017 or 2018. But that particular interest was useful because it looked at things like the cost of actually getting a business license, the length of time it took to get a business license, the level of digitization that governments had in terms of tracking business records, as well as things like designated, separated commercial courts for dealing with issues of breach of contract. Now, the challenge that African countries face across the board is that there are, 56 countries within Africa, and a majority of African countries fall within the bottom 25% in terms of ease of doing business. So the issues that I mentioned, some of those composite issues of the cost of setting up a new business, the length of time it takes, etc., these are substantively worse in Africa than they are almost anywhere else in the world. And as a quick point of comparison, to set up a C corporation in the United States can take as fast as 7 business days, and $300. And you can do it all online. There's not a single person you have to meet in person to get your business license, to get your tax identification number, to actually get the business registration, etc. Compare that again with Zimbabwe. $4,500 took 3 months to get all of that set up. And I still have to go through a separate process to get a tax identification number. It's prohibitively expensive, as you can see, relative to the relative to the median wage. You can see that the cost of getting a license is extremely high relative to that. Another example is the lack of appropriate commercial courts for actually litigating breach of contract. There are many examples of businesses that, when in contract with government, agreed to be paid in US dollars. Government decided instead to pay them in local currency, and there was essentially no recourse because the courts that oversaw those issues also happened to be courts that were stuffed by the party in power. So, as a result, you have no recourse but to accept a worthless currency or to shut up shop and walk away from your investment. So again, from an ease of doing business perspective, there's much to be desired from just the pure cost of just doing very basic things to the very basics of capitalism in terms of being able to enforce contracts and actually able to litigate where necessary to ensure that all parties within a contract are held accountable to the terms of the contract. So as you can see, many of the narratives that African countries talk about with regards to the injustices, the illicit financial flows, neocolonialism, all of that are very true and they're very valid. But that should not take away from the fact that these political elites themselves are heavily responsible for the very difficult conditions that result in underdevelopment within their own countries. The lack of accountability, transparency, and all of those things lead to environments that are repressive to economic growth. So, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. We have a lot more videos like this that educate you and talk more about what it's like to actually do business in Africa, to actually be at the front edge of clean energy transition, and what are the different things that we're doing to hopefully provide a basis for electrification that can help address a lot of these issues that we see over and over again when it comes to underdevelopment on the African continent. So we'll see you next time.